Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And I know many of you will be joining on YouTube after because we have a growing, I call it the asynchronous community here at HUBchat Hub. My name is Adam Cobb. I'm here with Tanya Decker today. And Tanya and I are going to collaboratively, we're going to have the first Ask Me Anything session. So we've taken in some questions that came in through the form that I provided over on Slack and also on the Facebook page. And then we're just going to, take this as an opportunity to talk about some cool subjects that came up. And then this will be the first example, and we'll do hopefully many more of these over the years. We're really in an early stage here at HUBchat Hub, trying to figure out what it's all going to look like. But I think one of the things that people love is the ability to get their questions answered, right? And you may find with me, I won't necessarily answer your question too directly, but I will have something to say. So Tanya, I think you and I can go straight forward into this one, and it's such a central question for us. For everybody who's in this space, the individual who sent this in said, "I've been thinking about farmers who want to transition from conventional to biological approach. Since they are financially dependent on yield, they cannot afford heavy yield losses. What are the concepts of planning for such a transition?" And I don't know if you want to start us off, Tanya, or because you haven't seen these questions, but
I
um,
haven't seen these questions. A
yeah.
great question, by the way. Well, there are many thinkers on this field as well. Ernst Gutsch has a way to think about this. I just was reading Nigel Palmer's book, also together with John Kempf. He has put together a new plant philosophy, let's say. Um, um, and then when I look at other great soil scientists, what really needs to be done is you need to look at where your field is at right now. You know, if it's already near Goldilocks system, right, you don't have much of a transition to do. But usually, when we talk about transitions from farmers, we're talking about heavy chemical use, right? So we need to first know how far, how many minus ones we have.
Mhm.
If there's a complete lack of organic matter, right, we absolutely need to help solve that because without organic matter, there's no way they can build the civilization below ground. So in that case, we'd need to make sure that we get roots in the ground and photosynthesis going so we get carbon in the soil. Um, and then there are many other practices, right? We need to know first what is the situation. Also, what is your kind of business? Are you a vineyard? Are you a dairy farmer? Are you an orchard? And we'd have to take it from there, one step at a
Absolutely.
time.
One step at a time. Yeah, that's the only thing that I was going to add to what you're saying here is it's depending on the area of land and the whole livelihood framework of the farm. Um, I am very skeptical of consultants or others who go in and say change everything right away because I don't think that's very contextually appropriate. And I think a lot of times we need to set up small areas to do like field trials, try different combinations of things. What happens if we reduce your fertilizer input by this percentage versus this one, and see what the land tells us about where it's at. You mentioned organic matter, and I do think that there's lots of people who they wait until the soil is so abused and turned into dirt to the point where they're at economic crisis before they consider a transition,
Yeah,
right? I,
that's where I meet them. Yeah.
hmm And so I'm really there's I think that there's people in the regenerative space,
Mhm.
corporate individuals, who sell products, people who sell courses and workshops, who want to say like, here's the magic, here's the instant solution. And
I
it's very
know.
seldom that way.
Yeah. That's
Hmm.
just not going to happen. If it's depleted, first we have to recolonize it with the right microbes, right? Then we need to get the plants in that can accumulate all of the minerals that are lost because you did not take care of your land. Those accumulators are usually called weeds, but there really are mineral accumulators, and they're there to help balance the chemical imbalance. And if you've gone through the balancing, that's when you can shoot into abundance, but not until. So if you are in a situation where you are actually it's a colonizing, right? We hardly any microbes you can find with your microscope, or if you see what germinates on its own, it will only be weeds, right? In order to cover the soil, which is great because we can read the weeds and we can tell the chemical imbalance from the weeds that germinate naturally.
Hmm.
Yeah, which is
Absolutely.
which can be kind of a shock if you see the anaerobe weeds come up. Velvet, you don't want to see them, but at least you get a good indication that below there's an anaerobic layer that is germinating these anaerobic weeds.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I love that this ends with the question, like, what are the concepts of planning for such a transition? Because
Yeah.
I think part again of the tendency for it to be like a marketplace and people to say, give us money for this course or this product or whatever, is that it gets really like spoken about as if it's some like recipe. And actually, I think of it as you as the land management individual, the person making decisions or facilitating, being the guardian or custodian of this land. Um, you have to understand a huge array of potential tools. And sometimes we call them like the principles of regenerative agriculture. So, like, yes, keep a living root in that system, but from that you have decision points like, is that going to be this mix of like oats and legumes? Is that going to be over here and be these plants? Am I going to have to cover certain areas in perennial grasses and graze them, right? And each situation is different. So the only thing that I think is really appropriate is to say, here's the concepts, here's the potential tools, and here's the way to mess around and find out what will work in this particular situation.
Yeah, but when we talk about concepts, Adam, I also think it's really important to understand some soil science, right? You have to understand the soil layers, or you really don't know how to intervene.
Yep.
Your interventions won't be very good because you don't understand the soil layers. Same thing with the nutrient cycle, right? Carbon, everything needs to be recycled. And so you are going to develop different eyes, right? So if it's my farmer, I will go walk around the land and point out, well, that's really great source for
Mhm.
compost. That's really great source, to do some plant juice fermentations. And so we have to also get new eyes and get a new view of what are the materials that we're really looking at, because
Absolutely.
we have forgotten to look.
We have forgotten to look. And in so many cases, there is a pool of indigenous knowledge and wisdom in the areas we work in, that says, here's what the ecosystems were here. Now, the tricky thing is in our modern context where climate may be different now, and some of the plants and animals and insects and things in the system may be like non-native now, right? That we need to have a blend of that understanding of here was the traditional or indigenous wisdom concept of how to manage these lands. And also, here is some understanding of, like you said, modern soil science, technology, all those things come into it. So, it's so hard to put a nice, neat little bow on a question like this. I think you and I have talked through some of the big concepts here, which I hope that our
One
audience.
more thing though is for very small plots, like I'm helping a couple of people with small plots, and we're
Hmm.
doing syntropic agroforestry, which
Hmm.
means you put in all of the layers, not all at once because it does go in phases, but that's a really quick way to restore your land because it pushes in so much carbon
Hmm.
with the plants that work together, right? They actually form a holobiont. So that's another great way, depending on how big your situation is. If you have a small plot, it's really great to do some syntropic agroforestry.
There you go. Well,
Yeah.
and you brought up the probably the central concept because a while back I was interviewed by a magazine about regenerative agriculture, and I gave them, here's the principles, integrate animals, keep the soil covered, all those, typical things. And I said, but at the end of the day, a system which accumulates carbon, especially
Hmm.
diverse kinds of carbon, to me
Yeah.
is regenerative.
Yeah.
That's enough. Like, and even if somebody were to use some herbicides or some chemical fertilizers, but the trajectory is they're building soil carbon, I would
Yeah.
say they figured out how to do it. They figured out how
Yeah.
to regenerate.
Yeah.
Yep.
Carbon is the magic word.
Yep. I told recently when I did some nutrient cycling um, presentation over in Benin, I said the answer for me is always soil carbon. We got to get more carbon in more diverse forms into our soils.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
let's take a step forward here. We got some questions I think that we'll talk about at length like this, and some that'll be, relatively quick. This one came in, which was how do we increase beneficial insects within ecosystems that we're trying to improve? And this is actually a picture of a planter in my garden from last year where I planted alyssum and marigolds because I was trying to attract some of these beneficials. Alyssum, in particular, in my area, seems to pull in some of these wasps that will take out aphids when
yeah.
they start to accumulate.
Yeah.
And there's lots of evidence that marigolds can both kind of push away some of the things that we don't want to attack our garden and pull in some of the things such as various pollinators that um, we want to attract. And I see it as the above ground diversity part as well. In fact, I only had a few marigolds last year, and then from a few, you can get millions of seeds. So I
Yeah.
am going to put marigolds all over the place this year in the
Yeah.
edges and spaces of my landscape. I've got more alyssum and new kinds of flowers that I have planned here, especially wanting over time to support whatever native pollinators are here to
Yeah.
match the plants that I have in my landscaping with that. But have you found any other um, strategies, Tanya, in your work that
Yeah.
really great for
Good.
beneficials?
What's really great about the marigolds too is that below ground they chase away root feeders because root feeders think they stink.
Hmm.
So in what do you call that again? In glass houses where you grow vegetables?
Hmm. A greenhouse, yeah.
Greenhouses, yeah. They're often used in greenhouses
Hmm.
to chase away the root feeders who take hold in those situations more readily because of compaction and stuff like that.
Hmm.
But the interesting thing about so weeds have succession, right? You have the early weeds that can completely live without an A horizon. They just live in the bare ground. But one level up from that, the weeds have triple functions. One, they have really deep roots to pump up nutrients, right? And the above ground biomass is going to be donated. But the third function they have is to produce nectar.
Hmm.
And some of the flowering weeds, like dandelion, I can't name them real quickly,
Hmm.
but they actually have really high nectar
Mm.
properties, and so they really do get as early as February or March. They start to bloom already because they want to feed the pollinators. Some of the trees are going to blossom, and then they already need to be aware and awake and flying around. And so all of these little flowering weed species are have these high nectar capacities. And so that's how we can feed the first ones that arrive until the blossoms blossom.
Oh, that's an excellent point. And actually, that's interesting that you mentioned that because I have an area I'm trying to sort of remediate. It had gone very barren. It was under a pine tree, which is not necessarily a pH issue, but a lot of times it's a soil moisture issue. Uh, and and I got a lot of buckwheat out there, which is already flowering early in the season, and that's a pollinator resource, right? For
Yeah.
any kinds of pollinators. But it's mostly because I wanted to have that ground be covered as long as possible, and now I've got some perennial ground covers that are coming awake, and so I'm going to put some more wildflowers in. And so
Yes.
my idea is to turn this what formerly was maybe like 1 meter wide by 4 meters long kind of dead spot, it looked like the moon,
Yeah.
surface of the moon, is to get it to where it's bursting with different colors and patterns and the timing of what's blooming, and or just someone in the house loves hollyhocks and I was like, I'll put hollyhocks out there. But we should say, because this is on the internet globally, um,
Yes.
it's very important that people understand what could potentially be invasive in their area. And in many cases, you can reach out to like native plant societies or native pollinator societies and get information about what things to avoid planting, or even the choice of cultivar. Like, I'm going to put in bee balm, which some people have problems with in my region, but I'm choosing a variety that's less aggressive. So there's lots of ways that you can, like nasturtium is another great example. Many people plant that in their gardens and then find that it sprouts forever because it made enough little seeds to become almost like a weed in their system. It has benefits. However, choosing the specific genotype that maybe is a little less aggressive can be part of the strategy there. And also just anything we mentioned, even marigolds, there's probably some places on earth that they don't belong, or some
Mhm.
contexts, like I wouldn't put marigolds in a native ecosystem, but my backyard is really far away from anything that they could potentially invade into.
Mm. On the other hand, Adam, if something does germinate, right, because seeds can be dispersed and we can call it it's invasive, but it's just airborne or it was carried along by an animal. But if it had fallen in soil where it couldn't germinate, you would never notice them, right?
Hmm.
But if they do germinate, even if it's invasive, it's telling you a story.
It is.
Because
Yeah.
why is it? Yeah, it anything that germinates takes on a function.
Hmm.
So we can always read the function.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need to write an extensive hub note for the community about my unique view on native and non-native organisms, because I use non-native organisms in my garden. And like, if you're outside of basically Turkey, like wheat is a non-native in your context, right? If you're outside of Peru, then tomatoes, potatoes are
Yeah.
not native.
Yeah.
So we have to coexist with these things, but it's about what are the characteristics that we need to be more cautious of? Fast reproduction, escape from any kind of predator that would limit their growth. Like there's this nuance to those
Yeah.
decisions. And then again, in my backyard in suburban USA, I'm not super close to any very vulnerable habitat that could get screwed up by what I choose to put
Right.
in my garden. It's not, there's a fence, there's boundaries there, accepting the possibility that um, birds come along and eat the seeds and disperse them.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So I don't think we can do anything really wrong.
Yeah, I mean, well,
It should be a seed bank everywhere, right? And so once again, after the fifth extinction, we're in the sixth now, but after the fifth extinction, the Earth came back with complete ecosystems and huge food forests that would, cross continents.
Hmm.
And how were they born into this food forest? It was the dispersions by animals. Mammals love to bury fruit and nuts and whatnots. Birds love to eat beshes. What's that again? Um, Fruit and then poop out the seeds somewhere else, kilometers away. And then other animals love to rub their shoulder against some of the wood and would crack it open and clear a new clearing.
Hmm.
And then now we have grass to grow, and they can graze. I mean, the food forest happened to come into existence naturally, right? By all
Right.
of these animals working together as one huge food forest crew, shaping it by their presence, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think to me, I would use the protection of biodiversity is the real thing I go to here. So, there in the central US where we have this beautiful tallgrass prairie that every meter square has 16 plant species in it. Um, there was the introduction of some Eurasian perennial grasses that actually we call it like a rolling front of invasion.
Yeah,
They
they
move every
pushed it
year
out. Yeah,
until there's like two species per meter
yeah,
square instead of 16. And the loss of pollinator resources from forbs that couldn't compete and all, there's reasons. A lot of times it's the combination of particular microorganisms and plants that they make like a novel relationship that is very competitive. So I would always say, like, you're right that part of the beautiful ecology we have in the world comes from these kinds of this area got invaded by something new, but then it turned out to perform a function that something else wasn't performing. That happens across millions of years of evolutionary time. And then in the last 100 years of human society, we've thrown sometimes 50, 60,000 non-native species at the same ecosystems. Like, again, I can speak in the North American context. We have
same.
billions of dollars of costs associated with the control of many invasive species from Eurasia because the Americas evolved so independently of the Eurasian continent after the last land bridge was covered. And so it's tricky, right? It's tricky. And again, I use a non-native worm in my composting, right? I'm not scared of a non-native just because it's a non-native, but I happen to constantly read and assess, like, is there a chance that this worm could escape and do damage in my um, native ecosystems here? Well, I think it's very, very low risk in my backyard to put out compost that has some of these eggs in it. Um, there's other species of worm, like the Asian jumping worm, that I wouldn't touch it with.
That's not good. Yeah.
Exactly,
But
right?
that's not good because it has no predator, right? I
Right.
was really not thinking about animals, but more of weeds. I mean, because they
Mhm.
are airborne anyway. Biodiversity is important.
It is. Well,
Yeah,
okay, we've definitely talked about this a
yeah,
lot, so let me move on. We got
killed
into
it.
fun subjects here. Um, I did get one nice comment where somebody just said, "How was your trip to Benin?" And actually, people online here might recognize my voice is a little scratchy. I have put myself on three different continents in the last 3 weeks, and the pollens that I've been subjected to or something are causing quite a bit of irritation in my throat and nose, but I'm getting past it. And I have a lozenge in case I start coughing here. But I had a wonderful time. I was in Germany at a conference on Kashmir briefly, and then I went over to the UK, and that was more of a vacation where I stayed with some friends and got to see beautiful castles. And I went to the Poison Garden up in northern England. That was fun. Learned about all kinds of poisonous, toxic plants. And then I was here in Benin towards the end. We stayed actually at a place named Songhai, and I need to do a hub note about Songhai and in particular the leader or the director of Songhai who's here in the photo with us um, because it's a beautiful vision, very permaculture related, where there's integration between crop production, animal production, and aquaculture. And each of those systems does something. The waste that it creates, the byproducts that it creates, can fuel abundance in the other systems. For example, and I need to do a little more research on this. He mentioned that the photosynthetic efficiency of algae is off the charts compared to like any land plant. And
Yeah.
there's an evolutionary reason for that. And so they do a lot of algae cultivation to feed tilapia, and then the
Yeah.
waste from the tilapia can feed into the to the terrestrial crop production. And I found that to be a really neat application of high science. They also do like effective microorganism use and polyculture plantings, maybe getting beans in there ahead of maize, for example. So it was very visionary. And the other big thing that I've talked with a few of my African friends about since is it reminded me yet again that Africans will solve the problems of food production in Africa and show the world how it can be different, right? There's such an opportunity because they can't just pivot to commercial fertilizers and the green revolution technologies due to the supply chain issues for them to create um, on-farm solutions, right? That move that efficiently capture energy from the sun and move it through the system, even utilizing methane as a source to run a factory equipment that can do value addition, like turning fruit into fruit juice. That's the kind of stuff they're doing here. So
Mm.
I'll write more about it, more extensively about it in the following weeks, but I just wanted to let everybody know it was I've seen many of these concepts on the farm scale, especially in Costa Rica and other places I visited, but this was large scale commercial operation. It's not just here in Benin, they've spread to Congo and other places as well. And I just love it. It's an African led solution to food security in Africa.
So, Adam, you sent me a picture of the soil god. Can you tell me about him a little bit? Because we didn't have much time.
Yeah, so Professor Godfrey here, I
Yeah,
got a
that's
chance
brilliant.
to sit down with him for breakfast, but it's so fun because I don't believe he originally came from a soils training background. He was at UC Irvine in California, but I think a lot more on the whole system really has like an engineer's brain. I think he did something
Yeah.
more in that field. The way water was captured and recycled, the way even waste was put
Mm.
through plants that would purify it, um, so that you could end up with clean water on the other side. Uh,
Mm.
it was
Was
it,
he treating gray water?
he was.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
good.
it's really cool. So
Yeah.
and he said something to the group in his conversation in his um presentation to us that everybody referenced at the end of the day as one of the most thought-provoking. He said, "Wealth and jobs are the natural thing growing out of water flowing through healthy soil.
Mm.
Wealth and jobs are the natural thing that comes from water flowing through healthy soil."
Yeah.
It's so profound. And he had a slide in one of his presentations that said, the future is helping society realize that soil is the center of civilization. You know how happy I was to see that
Yeah.
comment?
Yeah.
So very cool thing. Well, I'll have more to share, more pictures and things I'll put them in a hub note sometime in the
Please.
next
Yeah.
week
And
or
any
so.
of the examples and solutions and the water thing, the water structuring and whatever he invented, I'd love to hear all of it told to us all.
Absolutely. Okay, so as a pivot to another kind of maybe a more simple question to get is somebody had asked, how do you navigate the potential of manure contaminated with herbicides? I'm assuming they're saying as like a feedstock for composting in your garden or agricultural operation. So, is this something that you're running into, Tanya, when you're consulting
Not
with people?
with herbicides, but I do with the deworming. And so
Mm,
we have a law in my country because there's knowledge that they can live, there's certain parasites that can live outside the body's host
hmm
for about 20 days. And so our laws are that we cannot touch it for a month.
mm.
Then it should, have crossed over for sure, and then you can use it. But we're talking about most likely that there's some herbicides on the feedstock, and then it does not get digested, and then it ends up in the manure.
Yeah, I have run into this with people where, especially here in North America, I mean, we're pretty bad about some environmental regulations compared to the EU, compared to
Yeah,
almost
but
anywhere else.
we have a lot of people regulating it, right? And
Mhm.
so yeah, if you,
So that some of the pasture producers here will spray for broadleaf weeds in their pasture, which is unfortunate because that means they're taking out their legumes and many pollinator resources and all, but they want
yeah,
the grasses and consistency for grazing, ease and whatnot. Or they're spraying things that are ending up in cattle like feedlots, right?
mm,
Because some of the byproducts of other agricultural production are fed to animals in feedlot situations. And in either case, those broadleaf herbicides, some of them are incredibly environmentally persistent.
okay. So they
Very
don't get broken off. That's the
not for years in many
Oh
cases.
my God.
So then the animal's waste is put out on agricultural fields or put into gardens. And if someone is trying to cultivate a broadleaf like cotton,
Yeah,
or in their, a tomato plant or whatever, there's a huge array of what I grow in my garden is not grasses, it's broadleafs, or forbs, I would call them.
yeah,
Um, they can actually notice stunting in the plants once they apply the compost, right? Because enough of that compound that is disrupting the metabolism of the plant or
yeah,
whatever is still present. And some people have reported that they've had areas of their garden where they couldn't grow tomatoes or other things for years because they
yeah.
brought in contaminated um, animal manures.
Right,
So I'm very selective about animal manures.
right.
I have one person in my neighborhood that has some llamas, and I know that they don't deworm, and I know that they
Yeah,
don't treat with herbicides. And
yeah,
so I've brought a few buckets of llama poop into my garden,
yeah,
left them in the sun to dry, then composted them, right? I try to think of multiple layers of remediation for anything,
yeah,
right? And once I do composting, I often then turn it over to my worms as well because they can
yeah.
break things down and so I haven't had any issues. But I actually want to use some pelletized alfalfa in my next composting operation, and I was very careful about the brand to find one that didn't have any of those persistent herbicides. Now, as alfalfa, it's a broadleaf, so it wasn't going to have that one I was mentioning. I won't say the name because I don't want to put
No,
anybody on
don't.
blast, but
Yeah.
it's something to be aware of. And there are other herbicides that potentially got sprayed on that alfalfa. I'm not an organic producer. I think about limiting, but not necessarily eliminating some of those contaminants, but it's a whole bag in a giant compost pile, right? Like, and I have done my diligence to make sure I'm not bringing in something that has been proven to be incredibly persistent in the environment
Right,
because many organisms can break down compounds that are commonly used as agricultural poisons within a short period of time, like 100 days. But there's some that don't really break down very easily.
right. Have you tried? Do you know if anyone has tried to hot compost this manure that is contaminated with herbicides?
My understanding from again, this is just speaking to other gardeners that
Yeah.
even with hot composting, it can last for several years.
Oh, still, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And
sorry, I don't have a good answer.
yeah, well,
Um,
it's I think it's a growing concern because my understanding is a few years ago this pasture spray was not approved, at least here in the US, and then it became available, and now more and more people are using it. And they're
uh-oh.
using it because of a mentality that says we only want grass, right? We
Yeah.
want to create a monoculture of grass. And
Yeah.
that's actually extremely unfortunate. Now, I don't want people to think I'm too anti-herbicide because if I had a pasture and there were some like toxic bushes growing or something like that, I might spray them. But it'd
No,
be
we'll
like a spot
make a
spray.
fermented plant juice of it, Adam,
Mhm.
and then we will spray it on that place, and then their ecological function stops, right?
Right.
And they will go away. That's how we'll do it. Or we will make a specific herbicide specific for a crop. You know, in some cases, nettle juice is a great herbicide in certain situations. But on the other hand, what's that? Wood as wood
Wood
the
vinegar?
wood vinegar is
Hmm.
also can also be used in certain situations as a herbicide. So let's switch to organically grown herbicides. I'm not
I
against
prefer that.
herbicides either.
Yeah.
I just don't want the chemical ones because of the destructive side effects and generations after, right? If you have the
Mhm.
natural one, it doesn't have that devastating effect.
I agree with you in general. I mean, I don't like to tell producers like, no, 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 no to this, 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 and this. It's not my
Right.
mentality. However, I think understand the consequences. And you're right that the things that have been produced um, through synthetic means,
Yeah,
completely synthetic processes, often have much more dire consequences for more
yeah,
long term. Yeah.
it does. Yeah,
Yeah. So I would say avoid if at all possible or minimize, or it's all about that again, that's the land transition. I know
yeah,
some producers that are able to cut their herbicide use in, by 80% or 90%. I'm like, great, that's a great first step.
yeah,
Maybe
sure.
eventually we get to 100% reduction.
Yeah,
Cool. Okay, I think that came up with some interesting stuff here. Here's another picture from Benin where they were
yeah.
doing cultured effective microorganisms for use in
Ooh.
their system. And I love this question. It says, what are your view on companies that sell biology in a jug? Do you think that certain trophic level biology like fungi can survive for a length of time in such environments? What are your thoughts on, do you ever recommend commercial products for inoculation of?
I don't recommend them, but
Mhm.
some people do order them, and then I have to work with it. But I have a microscope, and so I often look if I can, wake them up. And that's just not the case. Of course, yeast I can wake up,
Mhm.
but fungi to kiss them awake, it's sometimes just one or two will germinate, but that's not why you buy the product. And so, if it comes down to the saprophytes or the mycorrhizal, I'd rather teach the farmers how to harvest their own. And
Yep.
they're also indigenous, so they're right there in their own backyard, knowing how to work in that situation. And so they're way more powerful than anything that you should or could buy in a store. It just doesn't work. It doesn't wake up.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a lot of what I've seen as well. In fact, I got excited in late part of grad school about a commercial mycorrhizal inoculum that was a little different. Many of them come in like sort of clay pellets, but
Yeah.
this was a liquid. And
Hmm.
when I looked on the microscope, and we had a $50,000 microscope in our lab, I said, I don't think any of these are alive. I think there are a bunch of dead spores in here and stuff, right? And so then the question comes up like, well, how and why? And most filamentous fungi, higher trophic level fungi, saprophytes and mycorrhizae and things, they need a lot of oxygen. It's really
Yeah.
hard to believe that a jug sitting on a shelf would have enough oxygen in it to really maintain. There are some methods apparently to kind of put them into dormancy
Yeah.
where their oxygen requirements would reduce. But I think well, even EM is really bent towards the anaerobic side of biology because of how they're produced. And I often, when people ask me about bokashi and EM and these kind of things, I say I'm interested in them. I have utilized them in my production systems as like I think of them as a step in succession though, not the
Hmm.
final part of succession because I want to get the aerobic organisms to have lots of good habitat and conditions to thrive in order to hold my system in that sort of middle of succession ground that's perfect for gardening and
Yeah.
most agriculture.
Yeah.
But it's a great shot in the arm. There's a lot of stimulation that can happen. So at certain uh, phases of plant development, maybe um, dosing them with an anaerobic home produced or farm scale produced product would give them a stimulation to grow bigger, to make their roots bigger. There's all these, it's a really cool concept of technologies behind all of that Korean natural farming, effective microorganism world. I'm actually not an expert over there. I'm more into once we get things established and move along in succession a little bit, how do we create the conditions for mycorrhizae to thrive? How do we create the conditions for saprophytic fungi to thrive? Nematodes, uh,
Yep.
protozoa. These are the things that I like to see in my worm compost. Yeah. Okay. Anything else about that? So you're not super keen on bug in a jug, and neither am I.
Nope. Nope.
Awesome. I think this is going to be maybe our last question today. Um, we got this one, and this is another picture from Benin because I think I sent this to you on your cell phone. I was so enamored with the way they did composting. But somebody says, in the tropics, is it necessary to compost? Is chop and drop beneficial instead? But they do composting there
Yep.
at Songhai, and I do think it's more beneficial than only chop and drop. But I wonder
Exactly.
what you think.
Totally. Yeah. I have some projects in Africa and I do teach them how to compost. And we also do chop and drop because, the chop and drop is to make sure that in the life cycle of the cash crops, we do give them the nutrients they need so
Hmm.
that they can finish their life cycle, right?
Hmm.
But beyond that, we have more waste that we want to not go to waste. And for that, we have a worm bin over there and we have compost that we do. So yeah, absolutely. You want to do both. You want to do all of it. You want to do chop
Hmm.
and drop and different types of composting. You don't need to do
Hmm.
one specific one. Whatever works in your region. It could be the what's the one from oh my God. It's the one with the circles in it.
Oh,
Johnson
Johnson
Sue,
Sue?
the Johnson
Yeah.
Sue. Yeah, that's another good one. Possibly not a great one for the tropics because it needs a lot of water.
Yep.
Yeah, but
No,
yeah,
I totally agree with you. I think of chop and drop strategies and just so I mean, I think the term kind of speaks for itself, but I will say just in case someone's never heard it before, that's where we're bringing in maybe the branches of trees or some kind of cover crop and using them more as a living mulch in the tropics that I'm not sorry, not a living mulch, a a mulch layer that will decompose rapidly. And in the tropics, you have with the heat and a lot of crops are produced in the rainy season, the wet season, it can be very rapid. It can be like days or weeks before you start seeing things that you've dropped on the soil surface disappearing. Well, a lot of the carbon in such systems is going in and then back out very quickly because it's a bacterial decomposition primarily. So the bacteria are nibbling on all the surfaces that they can get a hold of, and the nutrients, the minerals and things that is in that material is cycling, but the carbon is too. It goes into the bodies of the organisms and then they breathe. So they breathe out the CO2. And so chop and drop might be maybe only 20% of that carbon would hang around in a year, even, right? Maybe even less. Whereas a fungal dominant compost, like I think they're trying to make here, where they've covered the piles with these old palm fronds and things, they're trying to create a moist enough environment and with the right materials and settings that they get a lot of fungi in there. And fungi tend to take, when they consume materials, they tend to take the carbon and put it into more resistant forms in their bodies that don't just go back to the atmosphere really rapidly. And the fungi also entangle the particles of the soil. They make crumbs in the soil, and they can lock up carbon inside of these aggregates or crumbs so that 100 years from now it could still be there potentially, right? So it's two different strategies that are complementary. Um, if it's chop and drop, it's the carbon is around for a short time, but the mineral nutrients are cycling into the crop. The nitrogen and other things too are cycling into the crop. And if it's fungal dominant compost like Johnson Sioux tends to be,
Yeah.
um, the cool thing is you can combine these. You
Yeah.
can do things like roll down your cover crop and then put a slurry or an extract of a fungal dominant compost on it, and it'll incorporate a lot of that cover crop material into the soil to build carbon. And then maybe you come along later and do chop and drop, and you put out a little molasses or something, and the bacteria go crazy for a while when they've been fed, and they cycle nutrients so that your crop isn't um, is at maximum yield compared to what it can be. So it's a really neat opportunity. It's not one or the other, it's both and.
True. And you know, the other great thing about the plants that we chop and drop is that they regrow real quickly. Like
Hmm.
2 weeks time or 3 weeks time, you can chop and drop them again. And then in 2 or 3 weeks time, again, you can chop and drop them. So, you know, comfrey, for example, is a
Hmm.
plant you can harvest it 3 times in the growing season, and it pulls up so many nutrients. It's a great
Hmm.
chopper dropper.
You know, when I went walking in England, because there was a walking trail near where I stayed, I saw comfrey just growing in the ditches and stuff there. And I
Such a
thought,
great plant.
man, I should bring a backpack and just fill it up with this comfrey as I'm going along and take it back for the garden because there's a lot of amazing nutrients that and that's maybe the last thing I want to say about Benin is I spoke about biological or ecological nutrient management, and they had another speaker who really focused on the kind of fertilization style. And he was there all week, and I didn't engage with him in any arguments, but another um, speaker did. And
Mm.
they were arguing in French, so I was sitting there listening to the translation, just smiling because he said the other speaker said exactly what I wanted to say to this individual, which is you're really only thinking about the top 15 centimeters of the soil, and
Yeah.
you're really thinking of math that's it's logical, but it's not complete.
Yes.
And I think, okay, yes, because if you have a tree
Yeah.
in a local area, how deep does its roots go? How much is it drawing up
Yeah.
potassium or something from deep layers
Deep.
of soil?
Deep. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the biological or ecological way of is more holistic in these systems. And I'm not against supplementing when necessary. It's a
No.
huge problem in the tropics, especially tropical Africa, that more like the cotton is harvested and sent away, and it pulls out a lot of phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium.
Yeah.
If they're not replaced, then you're diminishing the fertility of the system over time. You're
But
mining.
that's why we want those plant fermented juices and the rock dust and the IMOs and all of
Mhm.
that,
Right.
because we have learned, right? We have learned from the chemical way of doing business, but we have to marry them, right? We have to not lose that knowledge, but we have to do it without. hurting the patient, which is the skin of the earth, right?
Absolutely. Actually, I love the skin of the earth because one of my favorite journals is called Geoderma, which would
Yeah.
suggest earth skin or soil skin, right? And
But
yeah,
actually, we shouldn't call it a skin, Adam. I'm reconsidering calling
mhm.
it your intestinal tract, your
Okay,
digestive system, your, because I think it's actually the same
yeah.
as your small and large intestine. Is it
Well,
called
yeah.
small and large?
I think it is probably, well, I would say it's both and because when I look at erosion, I think that seems a lot like when somebody has like dermatitis or something, right? There's a spot of damage, but then also with the especially fungi are my favorite example here because they kind of vomit on their food, all the
Yeah,
enzymes and things, and then they
yeah,
digest it outside of their bodies
yeah.
before drawing it in. And so soil is a stomach in a way, or is an intestinal tract as well. Yeah. Well, thanks for your time here today, Tanya. It's always fun to ping pong ideas with you. And I think we've gone through and answered some of these questions. So we'll just have this be an example of the kind of
Sure.
things we could periodically do here at HoloByant Hub. You and me, maybe we can find some other friends and rotate people through to
Love it.
to do these kind of Q&A things because it gives us lots of ideas about other content.
But Adam, if people could give feedback, if they like the long answers, or do they really want short answers and the next question and short answers and the next, I don't know. Do they like the long answers, or do we need to box it in? Time box it, say 5 minutes, no more.
Maybe, excuse me, my throat has decided to
Yeah, to throw you out.
throw me out. But I think I'll stop the recording now before I cough too much.
Bye, people. Thank you so much for your attention.